I feel pretty rough. I've got a very high temperature. This makes some pain, some shivers, cold in my extremities. It feels exactly like a cold, maybe a little bit worse. When I stand up, I feel like I'm going to fall over. I can't remember if I've ever had that. Whenever I've had a cold before. I hope I've got it. I hope it is COVID. Because I'd rather have the antibodies in my blood than take the jabs. Anyone who knows my opinion, anyone who has followed my comments on my Facebook page knows what I feel about the jab. So this is an update on the vlog that I made yesterday. I've already posted on Facebook that last night was pretty dreadful. The symptoms that I had at 11:30 had massively ramped up. I don't know how long. It's probably about 6 hours I spent in a fetal position, trying to block out the pain. It was every part of my body was racked with the pain. If these are things that we have to suffer, it's part of living. You have to trust your immune system, and if the alternative is that we live in fear, that we create a bogeyman out of something that hopefully I'm showing isn't anything to be afraid of for 99.9% of us, we've got to deal with that, and we've got to make the government aware that that is how we feel. People get flu, people get colds, people endure it and then get on with their lives. That's the way it's always been. COVID-19, in my view, and from what I've experienced so far, is nothing different. But the dangers of potential dangers from taking the experimental jab, for me, are not worth that risk. I'd rather take my chances with my immune system.
Meow, Huples cat. Sympathies to Leslie's family. It is very easy when you're not trained in science, or even if you are trained in science, to end up being anti-mask, anti-vaxxer. It's really simple. I have a cousin of Kitty's who actually is a forensic scientist. That's what she does. She works for the coroner as a forensic scientist, not as a technologist, but as a scientist. And she's strongly anti-mask and anti-distancing and anti-vaxxing, which is quite puzzling to me, and I've had some conversations with her. And do you know what it came down to? Her science isn't in the area of healthcare. And she repeated to me her reasons, which she didn't sway from, was that Kitty's hasn't seen any COVID patients. Kitty's only seen very old COVID patients, and the hospitals are empty. And she's seen evidence of this online, right? And people see evidence of this online. They see evidence for whatever they want online. So let's go from one extreme to the other.
It is time for people to get vaccinated. For those who are hesitant to go and get their first doses and their second doses. That's why I've asked the clerk of the Privy Council, who is responsible for the Federal Public Service, to look at mandatory vaccinations for federal employees. And we're also looking at federally regulated industries to encourage, or perhaps even to mandate, vaccinations for those industries.
That's Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, who happens to be the son of an older Canadian Prime Minister and happens to be independently wealthy. Leaving aside our poor choices when we vote for people to be in power of us, I would like to point out that I do not actually believe in vaccine mandates. I don't think people should be forced to take the vaccine, except if they work in certain industries, in which case, yeah, I do think they should be forced to. And I'll explain my point of view later on as we go through. But what I'm concerned about in this video isn't that they will or will not mandate vaccines, but that the anti-vax movement is getting so out of shape, it's going to actually generate tyranny for all of us because of their actions and inactions.
Recently, 2 passengers on a flight to Toronto were busted trying to present fake COVID-19 vaccination cards. Each person was fined $16,000 and may face legal charges.
It is time that the 80% of Canadians who are doing their duty towards their neighbors, towards their loved ones by getting vaccinated, be able to get back more and more to normal, get back more and more to regular life. For that, those who are hesitant, it's time to get your vaccine. They are safe, they are effective, and we're going to continue following science and the recommendations of NACI and our public health officers when it comes to further boosters. But right now, we know that getting vaccinated with 2 doses of an approved vaccine in Canada is the best way to keep yourself safe, including from the Delta virus.
Of course, people will listen to that and they'll hear some things and not hear others, but what he's basically saying, and he's true, is that about 80% of Canadians are absolutely fed up to the back teeth with the 20% who keep inundating online sites and writing nasty stuff and rubbish and trying to protest.
Police here in the German capital, Berlin, have come up against anti-lockdown protesters. Hundreds of people took part in marches in the city despite a court order banning such gatherings. Police in riot gear used pepper spray and physical force in an attempt to break up the demonstrations. They've also detained a number of people. The protests against coronavirus lockdowns in Germany have attracted a mix of groups, including anti-vaccination activists, conspiracy theorists, and the far right.
We know it's obvious if we vaccinate and we distance, we don't get transmission of COVID. Toronto has huge vaccination numbers, good distancing, we have tiny numbers, and we don't want to go back to having large numbers. And it's kind of clear to most people, if we stop transmission for a long enough period of time and we don't have people coming in who are infected, then we probably won't have another wave, and we don't want another wave because it could be us or our loved ones who are affected by it. If you look deeper here, he's saying he'll be guided by the science. There's very few epidemiologists out there that I'm aware of that in any way at all think mandates for vaccination are smart. It will cause a huge resistance and it will actually double down. The tiny percentage of people, and some of them are my subscribers or I'm subscribed to them, they're going to be ventilated and die, and they're going to still say vaccines and COVID's a hoax. We can't reach them, there's no point. What we need to do is reach the 20% of Canadians who haven't been vaccinated and get as many of them as possible to effectively change their minds. And he's quite right, if you can't fly ever again, you can't go to the cinema ever again, if you can't go to a bar or restaurant ever again without being vaccinated, like they're doing in many countries, like Israel, it does give a huge incentive to get vaccinated. And once people are vaccinated, the fear of the vaccine, generally speaking, is going to go away because, generally speaking, he's correct. It's a very safe procedure. However, then he throws in boosters. Now, boosters we don't know about. It's always been suspected that we'd have to boost the vaccination protocols. There is a definite link here that we may, as science goes forward, if infection rates start to rise again, boosting will become clear. And with so many vaccines left over in the West, there's a temptation just to go ahead and use them. So I have not discussed and will not discuss boosters until I actually get some decent evidence that they're required. I can see why you might think it's a good proactive idea, but I'm not actually convinced that boosters are a good idea, and then you have to go into the when do we give them. But he wants to make all federal employees unemployed if they're not vaccinated. And this is a common thing, and you're going to see this more and more all around the world in many, many countries, and it's going to infect the private sector, and it already is.
Disney joins a growing list of employers who are mandating vaccines in order to return to work. And Tom, it's not just Disney. You've got big companies like Walmart and Facebook that are saying the same thing. Do you expect this to be the norm for companies in the near future?
Yeah, I was leading a group of CEOs in conversation last week and talking about this, and the overwhelming feeling was that the majority of companies are going to come back and say vaccinated only in the office, over having people mandatory masks in the office.
Because they'd like to let people, if they're in the office, at least be comfortable, go free with that. What's been the holdup to this point? Was it the emergency use authorization, or is the tipping point really the Delta variant and the widespread that we're seeing right now?
Tipping point has been the Delta variant, and the fact that where most people's concern is that now people who've had the vaccine are showing that they have COVID symptoms or having COVID in fact. And so they're saying, what do we do to make sure that people feel safe? And the overwhelming concern when polling employees is that I feel safer around vaccinated people than non-vaccinated people with or without masks. And so what employers are trying to do is appease everybody, but you have to look at it sometime and say the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and do what you can do to get as many people into the office at once.
I'm aware that many of my subs live in little tiny bubbles. What he's actually saying here, he's not making it up. The vast majority of people want to or have been vaccinated, the vast majority of people don't want unvaccinated people anywhere near them. I'm seeing that in the hospital. I'm seeing people say, I want to know the vaccine status of my nurse, and if they're not vaccinated, I don't want them. And, oh, you don't have the right to that information, etc., etc. I don't agree. I think if you want to be a frontline healthcare worker or a frontline anything, like a dentist or a dental assistant, anybody that's actually going to be within a foot or less of somebody else's mouth and nose in an airborne pandemic with a safe vaccination, if those people cannot or choose not to, and the majority are choosing not to be vaccinated, they have no rights at all to potentially infect people, even if the person is vaccinated, and cause an ongoing wave of COVID-19. It's not something that we're actually going to see public supporting your point of view on zero vaccination mandates. You're going to see vaccination mandates from various employers, and they're going to be, if we get significant death rates, and of course with 100,000 people now getting infected a day, again in the United States, in 2 to 6 weeks, you're going to see an awful lot of death. Death concentrates the public's mind almost as well as sex.
335 penalty infringement notices issued in the last 24 hours right across New South Wales.
With barely any cases and barely any hospitalisations and barely any deaths compared to everywhere else in the world, Australia has put, again, for the second time, the army on the streets with the police, and again they're being very enforcing people, and it's kind of bizarre. I'm not going to show it, but they're literally walking up to two people sitting on a grass bench and demanding to know why they're on that grass bench and not hiding at home. So you have this huge array of responses. Like, some governments are much more keen on being controlling than others. If we get significant deaths, if we get breakthrough infections hitting the vaccinated, what will happen is they're going to look for scapegoats. Because remember, it can never be the CDC or the government's fault or Health Canada's fault. It's always somebody else's fault. And meanwhile, while these types of restrictions are going on for, I think, 300 national cases, what's going on in parts of Canada is kind of bizarre.
You are choosing to put people at risk by reducing reasonable protections.
That's the message shared by those gathering in downtown Calgary and at the legislature in Edmonton on Saturday. Hundreds calling on Alberta's government to reverse its decision to change the rules around COVID-19.
Starting on August 16th, we will no longer recommend that all those with mild symptoms seek testing. Isolation will no longer be universally, legally required if you test positive for COVID-19.
For Natasha Brubaker, whose child is considered high risk for the virus, these decisions hit close to home.
Our children are, by definition, vulnerable. They have no option to protect themselves beyond these health measures and the decisions made by the adults they are counting on to care for them.
Dr. Joe Vipond, an emergency room physician, is going further, saying the rolling back of restrictions goes against Canadians' right to life, liberty, and security.
I call on the Attorney General of Canada to reach out to our Premier and say that you are not allowed to violate the charter rights of 4.5 million Albertans.
In response to the pushback, Alberta's health minister pointed to the rise in those vaccinated, even though Alberta is below the national rate in both first and second doses.
We're trying to do it in a thoughtful way, in a staged approach based on really important metrics and milestones that were developed that are based on the science and based on the data.
For Dr. Joe Vipond, that response is not enough, and he's calling on Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health to resign.
It's quite evident now that public health is not actually putting in policies to protect the health of the public. I think this is a travesty, and I think she should resign.
I agree with him. I think you have to be a complete lunatic to want people that have been tested positive for COVID-19 not to have to isolate. It's completely insane. And Alberta's got a history of this. Now, also at the same time, by the way, Alberta's case counts are going through the roof.
In the next few days, 2 more provinces will drop mask mandates, Manitoba and Newfoundland and Labrador, though individual businesses may choose otherwise.
No shirt, no shoes, no service. I'm sure there will be some businesses who adapt that for masks.
And in that new space of individual agency, some already face backlash. Quebec is moving ahead with a vaccine passport, but the bureaucracy was not fast enough for this gym owner.
Tired of being put in this Ferris wheel of you're open, you're closed.
He's only allowing fully vaccinated gym clients, and he wasn't expecting the online hatred that followed.
Some are even threatening, hoping that this place gets burnt to the ground, as it's that bad. It breaks my heart.
Proof of vaccination or passports are controversial.
As much as a libertarian as you might be, the right to swing your fist ends at somebody else's nose.
Remember, a lot of people out there back in 2020 and even today would refer to face masks as cloth diapers, right? Face diapers. And to be frank with you, I speak moistly most of the time. And in an airborne pandemic, if you don't want to wear a face mask, what you're saying is, I'm okay with you spitting in my nose and mouth. It's really, if you think about it, it was never a logical thing to attack. And it was attacked because it was a sign of compliance, it was a sign of acceptance that there was in fact an airborne pandemic going on, when they didn't believe there was one because of various crazy reasons, when the entire globe was actually seeing an airborne pandemic. So you've got to be really careful. People who wouldn't distance, people who wouldn't mask, people who will not vaccinate, they are not going to change their point of view. They're a hardcore, raging between, I estimate, about 4 to 5% in Canada that are really hardcore. And probably, I'm guessing, probably double or even more than that in the United States of America, and a tiny number in Europe and a tiny number in Britain. What it is that hardcore are absolutely primed to be blamed by the governments who are opening up. If you open up and it all goes badly wrong, and again the hospitals have to close, and again there's TV pictures are full of ambulances outside the hospitals, people in tents, people are going to look for a blame object. The blame obviously should go to the inadequate healthcare experts in government and politicians that have opened up too soon, rather than say, hey, it's been 18 months, let's give it another couple of months and see what goes down here, let's really try for vaccinations voluntarily, and maybe look at mandates for vaccines for people who are actually in people's faces. But that's a far cry from saying that everybody who works for Sun Life in Toronto has to be vaccinated if they want to walk in their office, because if they choose to wear a mask, they have to be vaccinated. They don't wear masks. They're allowing politics, ideology, dogma to completely override common sense.
While nationally cases are going up, mostly among the unvaccinated.
Fortunately, severe illness trends are still declining.
So if our goal was to not overload hospitals, is focusing heavily on case counts as important in this new phase of the pandemic?
Those are lagging indicators, the hospitalizations and deaths. The leading indicators will be our positivity rates and our cases. So we always have to be kind of vigilant and watching that.
Much attention is now focused on watching our vaccination rates, and that second shot uptake is slowing. More than 30% of the population older than 12 still doesn't have 2 shots, with many bracing for more outbreaks in unvaccinated populations this fall.
We won't know till COVID's over how many actually die from it. We won't know till COVID's over how successful the vaccines specifically were. We won't know till COVID's over what percentage of the population being vaccinated blocked general transmission and blunted the waves down to almost nothing. We're not going to know, and yet people are asking, demanding to know facts and figures. And they say, well, they keep saying it's mostly the unvaccinated who've been admitted, and how do you know? Like on a comment section today, somebody asked me, who's collecting the figures? Do you ask them if they're vaccinated and what with and when? And I went, oh my God. You know, you always have no idea how healthcare works. Yeah, of course we do. We absolutely do, and we absolutely isolate people if we have any doubts at all. And then we do swab testing to make sure. We also look at symptoms, and we look at counts of cells and a whole bunch of scientific mumbo jumbo. So it's not like we're just pretending that they're unvaccinated. We know they're unvaccinated. We know that our case counts are so low in Toronto. To actually say we've had 10 admissions through my hospital in the last couple of days, which we have had, we can say what percentage of them are vaccinated or unvaccinated. But with 10 people, we're not going to say that. We're just looking at what we're seeing with our eyeballs. And what we're seeing with our eyeballs is about 90% of the patients who have been admitted haven't had any vaccines. They're a lot younger than they used to be. They're a lot sicker than they used to be, talking about last year in the Alpha variant. And I'm passing that information along. You do with that information what you want. But if you don't get vaccinated and you don't wear masks and you don't practice distancing, you continue to gamble with your life for dogma. Because perspective is really vital, and one of the major perspective things is the fact it depends on where you live, on how COVID lockdowns and how the pandemic's been affecting you. Of course, in other areas of the world, other than ours, because we're very, very exploitive and lucky, things are kind of grim.
This is one of the few food charities still operating on the streets of Dhaka. In a day, it will feed more than 2,000 people, many unemployed because of COVID-19. They include security guards, drivers, and domestic workers. And among the group, there's also more homeless children.
You can tell to the adults that there's no food, but how can you tell that to little children? Over the last year and a half, kids who come here, they've become our family.
Charities like Memankana depend on donations. When Bangladesh first shut down because of the pandemic last year, there were hundreds of volunteer groups. But coronavirus fatigue has set in, and people are now less willing to donate. Not everyone here is without a job, but many have seen their earnings slashed to little over $1 a day.
I'm a poor man. For months I've been suffering the effects of lockdowns. There is barely any income. That's why I come here to eat without guilt.
As the Delta variant fuels a surge in infections, some people have had to leave their jobs and take care of their sick relatives. Many businesses, schools, and government offices have shut down, and hundreds of thousands of people are now unemployed. Around 4.5 million people in Bangladesh work in the textile industry, but COVID-19 has forced many factories to close. While the government has allowed some to reopen, a full recovery seems a long way off. For workers, there's some hope, but they don't know how long it will last.
Here we can eat without worrying about the next day. Before I knew about this place, I spent 2 days lying inside a parked bus, literally starving.
Many are left wandering the streets of the Bangladeshi capital, hoping charities like these can provide what's often their only meal of the day.
But all the governments are not going to take this well. When they have civil disturbance on the streets, they're not going to take it well, and they're going to clamp down on civil liberties. They always have, they always will. One of the interesting things I think is going to be an issue here is people who are faking the system or abusing the system to try and circumvent government control during a pandemic. If we do get significant hospitalizations and death rates, like significant, in the next few months, I'm expecting massive reversal of opening, massive reversal of what's going on. And I think what you'll see at that point is the vast majority of people who are vaccinated are going to react very, very poorly to those who are still wandering around, maskless and unvaccinated. Don't listen to me about this. Listen to the FBI.
Concerns over fake COVID-19 cards are growing as some cities, universities, and a number of events now require proof of your vaccine status.
Well, now the FBI is issuing a warning for those selling or buying these phony cards.
And if you do a quick search online, you'll see some of these cards are available now that some restrictions are in place across the country. Tonight, we have an important warning from the FBI for you. Vaccination cards are intended to provide recipients of the coronavirus vaccine with important information regarding the type of vaccine they received and their date of inoculation. The creation, purchase, or sale of vaccine cards by individuals is illegal and endangers public safety. Cards were required to get into Lollapalooza in Chicago. New York City wanting proof within the coming weeks to enter many public spaces. In Chicago at that music festival, there were big concerns about COVID-19 card safety, theft of cards, and scammers selling bogus cards to kids to get in. Recently, 2 passengers on a flight to Toronto were busted trying to present fake COVID-19 vaccination cards. Each person was fined $16,000 and may face legal charges.
Any area with low vaccination rates is prime area for transmission of this infection. As it continues to infect, as it continues to roll around the world, coming in wave after wave, until it burns itself out or we have sufficient vaccination to stop it transmitting, the chances of the anti-vax movement, the anti-mask movement, generating civil disturbance with populations who are very much against what they're demonstrating about, you have much more likely chance of having tyrannical, authoritarian measures like banning completely demonstrations for their purposes. and then you'll get the police attacking and using batons and pepper spray. All of this stuff isn't helpful to you to avoid going to hospital and getting sick and dying from COVID-19. None of it is. And it's definitely not very helpful for you getting the economy back up on its feet in sane and sensible ways, which we easily can do. If that involves vaccine passports, I'm convinced that that may actually cause more problems than not, but I'm also convinced it will fade away and die. People will just not even look or hardly look within a few months of the case counts dropping heavily in the area they're in. What I'm concerned about is that on top of COVID-19, there's another thing going on called human-caused climate change. And again, the anti-mask, anti-vax group don't believe in human-caused climate change either. It's weird. But anyway, it is a reality. And we're going to see increasing dependence on authoritarian measures to deal with the effects on the economy and society of climate change and COVID-19. And the harder and the deeper these people are digging down into trying to promote their version of science against the world's scientists and doctors, the more likely they are to be targeted by governments and the population as scapegoats, and they will be used as a massive excuse to rip me away from what reasonable human rights and protections I have. This has been done before, remember? 9/11, Saudi Arabian people attacked America, and they decided, because of that, to do the Patriot Act and a whole bunch of other things that were at best an overreaction, but at worst an excuse. And I think the anti-vax movement is giving the governments of the world who wish to, and most of them do, more and more excuse to be tyrannical with their power. It's sad. The very thing these people claim they're fighting for, which is freedom, not my freedom, they couldn't care less about affecting me, I can stay at home, I've been told that, even though they're the minority. They are going to cause the excuse for us to all have our freedom stripped away. We're going to go beyond vaccine passports into national identity cards, I think, and even online tracking of where we are at all times and how many people we are meeting with if this continues onwards. If this continues with a significant number of people out there who are ignoring science, misinterpreting science, and actively promoting people not to distance, not to mask, not to vaccine, not to obey lockdowns when they're needed, and sometimes they are, this is going to cause the very tyranny they're claiming that they're trying to avoid. They're being manipulated. A lot of these groups are being manipulated. I haven't put it up, but it's quite clear that a lot of the senior people in the anti-vax movement are only doing it for money and fame. It's been shown quite clearly that they'll take money to promote one vaccine over the other. It's not good. You're being manipulated. Look at the science, the actual science, and where the data is not there, listen to doctors, nurses, paramedics, not the handful of crazy Karens who don't understand what the heck's going on and are demanding not to be vaccinated with this untried experimental vaccine. I mean, I don't know how many doses of a vaccine you have to give safely before you decide it's safe. I think we're way, way, way past that with all of the vaccines for COVID-19. We have not seen a single solitary case in my hospital of a vaccine-related issue. We have seen multiple COVID-19 patients in the probably over 1,000 since this started, and what we're seeing now after weeks of nothing is we're getting cases back in again with the Delta, and most of them in my hospital are unvaccinated, and that's the experience of most people in most parts of the world. If you like this video, and you probably didn't, give me a thumbs up. If you liked it, really, really liked it, and you want content like this, which is honest and opinion-based and some fact-based, give me a subscription. I will be focusing heavily on climate change as well as COVID-19. COVID-19, I think, very much for me is a distraction. It's the immediate SHTF, it's the immediate threat. That's why I'm dealing with it, and I must deal with it. But it's a distraction. In the background of all of this, the world is changing. The climate is changing. If you don't think it's human-caused, whatever, it is. But if you don't, it is changing. I have had people argue recently with me that the climate on Earth is either not changed or is changing in normal, natural ways. Both of those things are utterly false and easily disproved. But to cling to those beliefs shows an inability to actually understand that you're interpreting the data in ways that make you feel stronger, powerful, safer. It's all about fear. And we're living in very fearful times. And during fearful times, governments become very, very nasty. Stay under the radar, stop putting out videos that you don't understand about epidemiology and statistical analysis that you don't understand. You're putting yourself right in the crosshairs. And the same goes for human-caused climate change videos as well. I think we're living in very, very dangerous times. And I think the times are more dangerous than people actually understand. And with that somewhat, again, depressing message, have a great week. Toodles. This has been a Hungry Terrier production 2021.